I have entitled this message, How to Have an Enemy. How to Have an Enemy. Would you pray with me? Breathe on me, breath of God. Fill me with life anew, so I may love as you do love, and do what you would do. Breathe on us, breath of God. Fill us with life anew, so we may love as you do love, and do what you would do. Let all of God's people say amen. Some betrayals are unforgivable. A boy shares his dreams with his brothers, and they decide to kill him because of his dreams, or perhaps because they are not dreamers themselves. They sentence him to death by enslavement. The boy grows up in captivity, far away from the love and refuge of his community, which believes that he is dead. What happens to a boy presumed to be dead? What happens to a boy who is ripped from community? Well, at first he is in the prison pipeline, but then he pulls himself up by the bootstraps and hustles his way into the royal cabinet. I have learned over time that life does not really move in a straight line. Life is shaped more like a circle, and of course, Joseph learned this too. Now a grown man, far removed from the brothers that deserted him, Joseph is in a position that matters when the famine comes. He is in a position that matters when those same brothers, the ones who left him for dead, now need him to stay alive. I know that perhaps our hermeneutical impulse is to rush on to see what the end of this story is going to be, but I want to linger here a bit. I want to linger in the tension between mercy and justice. Here comes the day in Joseph's life when the opportunity he's been waiting on, dreaming of, is right in front of his face. See, I gotta believe that Joseph had laid awake in his prison cell night after night, replaying the events of the worst day of his life. Instead of counting sheep, he counted the ways he could have fought back when his brothers assaulted him. I imagine that Joseph angrily tossed and turned as he remembered all the signs he missed. His brothers had probably shown their true colors before, and he ignored the signs. Think back. You have had a similar day. That day when what went around finally came around. That day when you were granted your second chance to throw shade, to exact punishment, to make them pay. So you know what it's like to be caught between that rock and that hard place, caught between just desserts and just letting it go. That's where Joseph was when we find him in this scene in the book of Genesis. And you know, I, for one, am relieved that Joseph acted like the scorned brother he was. See, a little earlier in Genesis, before we get to the tender tale of a family reunited and then upgraded to Pharaoh's favorites, if we're willing to read the Bible, read the words on the page, we see that Joseph seeks to betray the ones who first betrayed him. In Genesis 42, Joseph concocts a plan to give his brothers, the ones he had not seen in 20 years, the runaround. He accuses them of being his enemies, spies sent to survey the impact of the famine so it could be exploited. He gives them a taste of their own medicine, first locking them all up and then releasing all but one, and then revising his revenge scheme again, and then revising it again. Joseph knew his brothers were remorseful. He knew they were starving, but he also delighted in their shame. Yeah, Joseph eventually forgave his brothers for trafficking him, for leaving him for dead, but he toys with them a little bit first. Though the statute of limitations for his brother's crime had expired, Joseph decides he cannot show mercy until he has tasted a little bit of justice. And I'm with that Joseph, if I'm honest with y'all. Some betrayals just cannot be forgiven. Some violations cannot be rolled back. Some losses cannot be recovered. You know, the hundreds and thousands and maybe millions of children whose bodies were breached by pastors and priests and deacons and daddies and cousins and coaches and anybody else who vowed to cherish and protect them. Should they just move on? Should they just forgive? Should they love their enemies? The loved ones of those 935,000 American people who died from a disease that some elected officials and healthcare providers claim to this day is a figment of our imagination. Should they all just let it go? Should they just move on? Should they just love their enemies? What about the human beings who are warehoused in cages, sent to die social and biological deaths, miles and miles away from anybody who calls them by their names and not a number? Should they just surrender to their shame? Should they just move on? Should they just love their enemies? I'm trying to stay focused. Trying to stay focused during Jesus's sermon on the plain in Luke chapter 6, but I keep getting distracted by the spectacular way that the enemies of justice just keep showing out. These enemies mock our mercy. They exploit our piety. They weaponize our faithfulness. Jesus must not have had enemies like ours. How dare he demand that we love them, bless them, pray for them? And our love and blessings and prayers ain't changing nothing, Jesus. Our enemies still want us dead, Jesus, and they got the power and the resources to make us dead, Jesus. I remember learning the word enmity in church. It looked like an SAT word on the list of all the things that would send me to hell. Let me today offer this bit of good news from my colleague, the Reverend Melissa Flora Bixler, who's the pastor of the Raleigh Mennonite Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. In her book, How to Have an Enemy, she writes, enmity is not a moral failure. Flora Bixler distinguishes between the kind of animus that is born out of a fear of being harmed and the hostility that is born out of a fear of losing power. Let me say that again. There's a difference between enmity that is born out of a fear of being harmed and enmity that is born out of a fear of losing power. See, enmity is not an illogical conclusion for those of us who have come over a way that with tears has been watered. Antagonism makes sense when material harm is chronic. How can we be reasonable in the face of all of this? How can we dialogue our way to righteousness? Enmity is reserved for those who feel like our prayers are desperate dead ends. Enmity is reserved for those of us who will not, like Isaac, be saved by the ram. Enmity is reserved for us because our babies actually don't emerge from their graves after 3 days. I have enmity in my heart. That is my confession. And so when I read Jesus's sermon again, I got to do some reframing. I got to reframe enemy love so that I don't end up hating my own self. Reverend Melissa writes that we love our enemies by choosing to withhold the power we have to destroy them. We love our enemies by creating a world that releases them from the wages of their own violence. We love our enemies by creating a world that releases them from the wages of their own violence. We cannot love our enemies and defend those who are being crushed under our enemies' feet at the same time. We must make a choice. So for me, the call to enemy love is not a call to absorb abuse, not a call to make friends with humiliation, not a call to make room for death without protest. The call to enemy love is a call to defend those being crushed by those enemies. It is a call to refuse evil as an acceptable feature of life. And it is the call to the discipline of rage. It is a call to share rage with some other folks who share enemies. It's a call to get together with those folks and remake the world such that the world is not how it is now, such that violence is not the great problem solver. And when violence is not the great problem solver, our enemies will indeed receive mercy. They will not reap in violence what they have sown in violence. And that's love. I hear you, Jesus. We cannot rely on the tools of death to enrich our lives. We cannot meet violence with violence. But there are enemies of the gospel. This is not a call to not have enemies. It's instead a call to be pissed. And when we pair that anger with the work of remaking the world, we embody an already but not yet gospel. That's when we say, I've been to the future and we win, but we are not yet done fighting. I've already seen the shadows bouncing off the walls of empty tombs, but America is not yet tired of killing her people. Already, not yet. I know our enemies are coordinated and tenacious. I know it seems like our enemies never have more month than money and always get away with everything. I know we are tired of feeling foolish for going high when ain't nothing up there but the clouds and maybe Michelle Obama. I know our enemies can morph and shift and pivot before we have time to remember that the more things change, the more they actually stay the same. But here's the good news. God, in fact, lasts forever. Our enemies won't be able to outrun God. God will get God's vengeance. Tyranny will finally run out of cards to play. The rot of this world will be fully revealed, and the stench will finally be too great to ignore. The master's tools of extortion and despair and death, the master's tools will finally, inevitably destroy the master's house. There is no statute of limitations on God's vengeance, and for that I am grateful. But empire's clock, yes, it will expire. That's what they meant when they said trouble won't last always. What goes up must come down, and twinkling within the wreckage of the end of this world order will be the beauty of the New Jerusalem. So if we are willing to fight for an abundant life that we know exists but have never felt before, if we are willing to hold on to a resurrection faith, even as death surrounds us, if we are willing to be otherwise counterintuitive, time will finally run out. And I believe that when it does, God will make good on God's promise to finally vindicate us. And here's what I also know, the countdown began a long time ago. When I walk down the halls of human history, I see the clock, I hear the clock ticking. Every time an enslaved or incarcerated person, enslaved ancestor, incarcerated person says no more, tick tock. Every time a group of Black folk got together to dance unashamed in the clearing or in the sanctuary or in the kitchen or in the club, tick tock. Every time Indigenous folks refuse to let this nation take even more land, even more water, even more dignity, tick tock. Every time queer and trans folk reclaim our time and our bodies, tick tock. Every time poor folk stubbornly insist on feasting on that secret cup of gladness that uptight elites cannot understand, tick tock. Time will finally run out. My hope is built on God's vengeance. The end of enemies will soon come. May this be so. Thanks be to God.